Before Tinder, before marriage ceremonies, before humans even figured out how to grunt coherently, sex was already the driving force behind everything we'd eventually become. And let me tell you, our ancestors weren't exactly writing love sonnets or lighting scented candles. Today, we're peeling back the layers of evolutionary history to uncover the bizarre, sometimes shocking, and definitely NSFW sexual behaviors that shaped human civilization. Think modern dating is complicated? Wait until you hear what your great times about 10,000 grandmother was up to in her cave. And trust me, she wasn't worried about swiping right. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Every weird, taboo, and downright shocking practice we're about to explore, it's written into your DNA right now. Let's get one thing straight. For early humans, sex wasn't recreation. It wasn't about connection or intimacy or finding the one. It was about not going extinct. Period. When your average lifespan barely hits 30 and saber-toothed cats are treating your tribe like an all-you-can-eat buffet, every successful pregnancy was basically winning the lottery. We're talking about species like Homo erectus, who spent nearly 2 million years figuring out fire and pointy sticks. Then there were the Neanderthals, built like linebackers, smart enough to make tools, but apparently not smart enough to avoid what was coming next. And let's not forget the mysterious Denisovans, who we only discovered through a pinky finger bone in 2008. Talk about leaving a small impression. These weren't just different cultures, they were different species. Imagine if aliens landed tomorrow, and some humans thought, you know what, let's see what happens. That's essentially what our family tree looks like, except instead of aliens, it was your cousin Grok with a prominent brow ridge and surprisingly flexible moral standards. But here's where things get really interesting. Survival came with some pretty twisted rules in the bedroom. So remember everything Disney taught you about true love and soulmates? Yeah, toss that right out the window of your cave. Early human societies were basically one big, chaotic episode of Love Island, except instead of getting voted off, you got eaten by a giant bear. Genetic studies have revealed something that would make your Sunday school teacher faint. Many early human offspring had multiple potential fathers within the same group. We're talking about paternity confusion that would keep Maury Povich busy for centuries. DNA evidence suggests that what anthropologists politely call sperm competition was basically the norm. Think about it logically, though. When your entire dating pool consists of maybe 30 people, and half of them are your relatives, and the other half might get trampled by a mammoth tomorrow, exclusivity becomes a luxury you literally can't afford. Shared sexuality wasn't just accepted, it was survival strategy. But here's the part that'll really mess with your head. For Neanderthals, getting intimate wasn't some private affair behind closed cave flaps. It was community business, observed, participated in, and probably critiqued by the entire tribe. And speaking of community involvement, wait until you hear about their approach to genetic diversity. Okay, buckle up, because we're about to discuss something that makes modern mixed relationships look positively conventional. Your DNA, yes, yours, sitting there judging these ancient weirdos, contains proof that your ancestors were getting busy with entirely different species of humans. Every person of non-African descent carries between 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. That didn't get there through a handshake. Somewhere in your family tree, great-great-grandma looked at a stocky, heavy-browed Neanderthal and thought, you know what? I'm feeling adventurous tonight. But wait, it gets weirder. We've also got Denisovan DNA floating around in there, up to 6% in some Pacific Islander populations. These were encounters between species that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years. Imagine if humans today started hooking up with a species that split from our lineage around the time we diverged from chimpanzees. That's the level of genetic gap we're talking about. Now, here's where things get uncomfortable. Given the nomadic nature of early human groups and the whole survival of the strongest mentality, not all of these interspecies encounters were probably, let's call them, consensual by today's standards. When resources were scarce and territory was everything, sometimes taking mates was just another form of conquest. But if you think interspecies hookups were the weirdest part of early human sexuality, wait until you see what they were carving into their cave walls. You know what early humans loved almost as much as actual sex? Drawing about it, obsessively. Archaeologists have found fertility symbols, phallic carvings, and exaggerated sexual imagery scattered across every continent where early humans set foot. And when I say exaggerated, I mean these people had some seriously unrealistic expectations about human anatomy. Take the famous Venus figurines, small statues of women with comically oversized breasts, hips, and genitalia, and basically no facial features. Modern anthropologists politely call them fertility symbols, but let's be honest, early humans were basically carving prehistoric pinups. These weren't artistic expressions of the divine feminine, they were Stone Age pornography with a spiritual twist. But it wasn't just about decoration. Evidence suggests that sexual rituals were tied to hunting magic, seasonal ceremonies, and tribal bonding. Picture this. Before heading out to hunt a mammoth, the tribe gathers for a fertility ritual that would make a Roman orgy look like a church potluck. The logic? Ensure the hunt's success by celebrating life-creating energy. Some anthropologists theorize that these sexual rituals weren't just spiritual, they were practical population management, control reproduction, control the tribe's future. But speaking of population control, early humans had to deal with a problem that would make modern genetics counselors break out in cold sweats. Here's where we venture into territory that makes even anthropologists squirm a little. When your entire world consists of maybe 150 people scattered across thousands of square miles, and you need to keep the species going, you run into what economists would call a supply shortage, except instead of toilet paper, we're talking about genetically suitable mates. DNA evidence from multiple early human populations shows genetic bottlenecks so severe that some groups went through periods where the entire gene pool consisted of fewer breeding pairs than a modern college dorm. What does that mean in practical terms? Well, let's just say family reunions were a lot more complicated. Recent genetic studies suggest that incestuous relationships weren't just occasional accidents. They were necessary survival strategies. When the choice is between reproducing with your cousin or watching your entire genetic line disappear into the fossil record, guess which option evolution favored? Spoiler alert, it wasn't extinction. Modern cultures developed incest taboos. For good biological reasons, genetic diversity prevents nasty recessive diseases. But early humans were playing genetic roulette with loaded dice, hoping that whatever offspring survived would be stronger than the alternatives. Sometimes it worked, creating resilient bloodlines. Sometimes, well, let's just say natural selection was ruthlessly efficient at correcting mistakes. But if you think genetic risk-taking was the most disturbing aspect of early human sexuality, wait until we discuss what happened when romance met raw power. Time for the part of our evolutionary story that definitely won't make it into elementary school textbooks. Early human societies operated on dominance hierarchies that would make a prison yard look like a progressive workplace. And guess what determined who got to reproduce? Here's a hint. It wasn't personality or shared interests in cave painting. Archaeological evidence shows clear patterns of sexual selection based on physical dominance. The strongest males didn't just get the best hunting spots and the choicest mammoth steaks, they got exclusive or primary access to reproductive females. Think alpha male behavior, except with actual life or death consequences and no modern legal system to keep things civilized. Skeletal remains tell a brutal story. Fracture patterns in female bones suggest that sexual coercion wasn't aberrant behavior. It was standard operating procedure. When your survival depends on producing offspring and society's structure puts all reproductive power in the hands of the physically strongest, consent becomes a luxury that evolution couldn't afford to prioritize. Some anthropologists theorize that rape and sexual violence were so common in early human societies that females evolved specific physical and behavioral adaptations to cope with it. Hidden ovulation, for instance, might have developed partly to prevent males from knowing exactly when females were fertile, reducing targeted sexual aggression. But here's the twisted part. All this violence and coercion actually served evolution's agenda in ways that are both fascinating and deeply disturbing. So what did all this prehistoric sexual chaos actually accomplish? Well, aside from traumatizing anyone who thinks too hard about their family tree, it created the most genetically diverse and adaptable species the planet had ever seen. Us, every bizarre sexual encounter, every taboo relationship, every violent conquest added another thread to the genetic tapestry that would eventually become modern humanity. That Neanderthal DNA you're carrying, it gave some populations better immunity to certain diseases. The Denisovan genes, they helped humans adapt to high-altitude living. Your ancestors' questionable romantic choices are literally keeping you alive today. The genetic bottlenecks that forced incestuous relationships also concentrated beneficial mutations, sometimes creating evolutionary advantages that spread rapidly through small populations. It was like evolutionary gambling. Most bets failed, catastrophically, but the ones that paid off created superhumans compared to their predecessors. Mental adaptability, disease resistance, physical diversity, even our capacity for complex social behaviors, all of it traces back to a chaotic reproductive free-for-all that lasted hundreds of thousands of years. The sexual practices that would horrify us today created the biological foundation for everything we consider civilized. But the most mind-bending part, we're still playing by rules written in caves 50,000 years ago. So the next time someone tells you that human sexuality is natural or traditional, remind them that our natural tradition includes interspecies breeding, community-supervised reproduction, and survival-based incest. Romance, monogamy, and sexual consent, as we understand them today, those are modern inventions, newer than agriculture, newer than writing, newer than the wheel. Our ancestors weren't immoral monsters. They were survivors playing by evolutions. Brutal rules in a world where every decision was life or death. They experimented, adapted, and did whatever it took to keep the genetic flame burning for one more generation. And thank evolution they did, because otherwise you wouldn't be here to feel awkward about their choices. The uncomfortable truth is that every modern human is the product of tens of thousands of years of sexual practices that would violate every social norm, religious teaching, and legal framework we've built. We're all descendants of the weird kids in evolution's high school. Think this is as bizarre as human evolution gets? Wait until you hear about the cannibalistic funeral rites that some anthropologists think were actually romantic gestures. But that's a story for another day. Picture this. It's 50,000 years ago. There's no Netflix, no delivery apps, no social media. Hell, there's barely language. But you know what early humans had figured out better than we have today? How to make reproduction so entertainingly weird that anthropologists are still discovering new ways our ancestors got freaky in the fossil record. We like to think we invented sexual complexity, but early humans were writing the playbook while we were still figuring out fire. They had orgies that strengthened tribal bonds, interspecies relationships that rewrote genetics and reproductive strategies so ruthlessly effective that they literally created the blueprint for modern human behavior. Fair warning, if you're easily shocked by the idea that your ancestors were basically horny survivalists with zero inhibitions and questionable taste in partners, maybe skip to a nice documentary about butterflies. For everyone else, let's dive into the sexual practices that were so effective at ensuring human survival. They make modern evolutionary biologists question everything they thought they knew about natural behavior. Because, spoiler alert, nothing about early human sexuality was natural by today's standards. To understand why early humans developed such creative approaches to reproduction, you need to grasp just how apocalyptically difficult survival was. We're talking about a world where stepping on the wrong twig could alert a predator that would turn your entire family into lunch, where a broken leg meant death, where winter meant watching half your tribe starve or freeze. Homo erectus had the right idea: spread out across continents, diversify your bets. They were the first human species to really go global, and they did it by being remarkably flexible in their reproductive strategies. When you're pioneer species colonizing new continents, you can't afford to be picky about mating protocols. Neanderthals took a different approach. They built incredibly tight-knit communities with complex social structures, advanced tool-making, and even art. But tight-knit communities create their own problems when it comes to genetic diversity. Problems they solved in ways that would make modern ethicists write very angry academic papers. And the Denisovans? We know so little about them that every new genetic discovery rewrites the textbooks. What we do know is that they somehow managed to leave genetic traces in populations from Siberia to Oceania, which suggests they were either incredibly well-traveled or incredibly welcoming to visitors. Each species developed survival strategies that prioritized genetic continuation over social comfort. And comfort, as it turns out, was the first casualty of effective reproduction. Modern humans spend billions of dollars on dating apps trying to find the one. But early humans had already figured out that monogamy was a luxury for species that weren't constantly on the verge of extinction. Their approach to relationships was less "till death do us part" and more "till something bigger than us eats everyone." Recent genetic analysis of ancient remains reveals that up to 30% of children in some early human groups had uncertain paternity within their own tribe. That's not poor record keeping. That's intentional reproductive strategy. When every pregnancy is a gamble against infant mortality, disease, and predation, you hedge your bets by ensuring genetic diversity within each generation. But it wasn't just random hookups. Evidence suggests these communities developed complex social protocols around shared sexuality. Think of it as prehistoric polyamory with survival benefits, shared paternal investment in offspring, reduced male competition violence, stronger tribal bonds through intimate connections. It was like group therapy, except the therapy was literally group reproductive activity. The Neanderthals took this concept and weaponized it. Archaeological evidence from multiple Neanderthal sites suggests that reproductive activities weren't private affairs. They were public events that reinforced social hierarchies, celebrated successful hunts, and marked seasonal transitions. Basically, they turned sex into community theater. And if you think community-supervised reproduction sounds uncomfortable, wait until you hear about their approach to dating outside their species. All right, let's address the elephant in the cave. When Homo sapiens first encountered Neanderthals, around 45,000 years ago, it wasn't exactly a diplomatic cultural exchange. These were two species that had been evolving separately for over 400,000 years, with different physical builds, different brain structures, and probably different social norms around everything from tool making to mating rituals. Yet somehow, Despite having no common language, potentially hostile territorial disputes, and physical differences that would make modern humans look like different species, they managed to produce viable offspring. And not just once or twice. Genetic evidence suggests these interbreeding events happened repeatedly across multiple continents over thousands of years. The mathematics of this are staggering. For Neanderthal DNA to persist in modern humans, at the levels we see today, there had to be sustained interbreeding over thousands of years. This wasn't a few chance encounters. This was systematic genetic mixing between species that probably couldn't even communicate verbally. Anthropologists euphemistically call it genetic admixture, but let's be honest about what this probably looked like on the ground. When nomadic Homo sapiens groups encountered settled Neanderthal communities, the stronger group often absorbed the weaker one. And in prehistoric societies, absorption had very specific implications for the women involved. The Denisovan evidence is even more mysterious. These encounters happened across such vast geographical areas, from Siberia to Papua New Guinea, that some scientists theorize Denisovans might have been actively seeking out other human species for reproductive purposes. Either they were incredibly social travelers, or they had developed cultural practices around interspecies reproduction that we can barely imagine. But if interspecies dating sounds complex, wait until you see the artwork early humans created to celebrate their reproductive creativity. Early humans didn't have Instagram, but they definitely had a thing for documenting their sexual interests. And by documenting, I mean carving gigantic penises into every rock surface they could find and sculpting fertility figurines that would make modern erotica look prudish. The cave art at Lascaux isn't just hunting scenes and handprints. There are explicit sexual images that archaeologists spent decades pretending not to notice. Phallic symbols, larger than the animals depicted nearby. Fertility scenes that leave absolutely nothing to the imagination. These weren't hidden away in private spaces. They were prominently displayed in central gathering areas. The Venus figurines found across Europe tell an even stranger story. Over 200 of these sculptures have been discovered, spanning 25,000 years of human culture. They're so sexually exaggerated that early archaeologists assumed they were religious objects because they couldn't imagine prehistoric humans creating pornography. Spoiler alert, prehistoric humans absolutely created pornography. But here's what's really fascinating. Many of these sexual artifacts were found in contexts suggesting they weren't just art or religion. They were functional objects, possibly used in actual reproductive rituals. Some show wear patterns consistent with regular handling. Others were deliberately broken or modified, suggesting they played roles in ceremonies we can barely reconstruct. Recent analysis of pigment residues on some Venus figurines indicates they were originally painted with red ochre, the same pigment used in burial rituals and hunting magic. Sex, death, and survival were apparently so intertwined in early human culture that they celebrated them with the same sacred materials. And if you think using sex as spiritual practice is weird, wait until you hear about what happened when there literally wasn't anyone else left to choose from. Let's talk about something that makes modern genetic counselors reach for emergency: tranquilizers. The periods in human evolution when the entire species bottlenecked down to maybe 1,000 breeding individuals. Imagine if the entire genetic future of humanity depended on the reproductive choices of everyone currently living in a small town. Now imagine that small town is scattered across continents with no communication technology. The Toba supervolcanic eruption 74,000 years ago nearly wiped out humanity entirely. Genetic evidence suggests the human population dropped to between 3,000, 10,000 individuals total. Globally, that's fewer people than attend most high school graduations, and they were responsible for continuing the entire human species. What happens to sexual taboos when the alternative is extinction? They become evolutionary luxuries that species can't afford. DNA analysis of post-Toba populations shows genetic patterns consistent with extensive inbreeding, not because early humans were ignorant of the risks, but because there literally weren't enough unrelated individuals to maintain genetic diversity. Some isolated populations show evidence of reproductive strategies that modern genetics would classify as catastrophically inbred. Yet these same populations survived ice ages, migrations, and environmental disasters that wiped out countless other species. Their genetic mistakes somehow created evolutionary advantages that we're still discovering today. The most disturbing part? Mathematical models suggest that humans went through multiple genetic bottlenecks where successful reproduction required breeding choices that violated every modern taboo. Parent-child, sibling-sibling, multi-generational inbreeding, all documented in the genetic record as necessary survival strategies. But incest was just the beginning of early humans' willingness to cross moral boundaries in the name of species survival. Here's the part where we stop pretending that early human sexuality was just different cultural norms and acknowledge that Much of it would be classified as systematic sexual violence by any modern standard, because when survival depends on reproduction and society is structured around physical dominance, reproductive autonomy becomes another casualty of evolutionary pressure. Skeletal analysis of early human remains shows patterns of violence that disproportionately affected reproductive age females. Healed fractures consistent with restraint, pelvic damage suggesting forced reproduction, burial patterns indicating lower social status. For females across multiple cultures and time periods, the evidence points to reproductive systems where physical strength determined reproductive access, and female choice was limited by male competition and social hierarchy. In some early human societies, the strongest males maintained harems through force, while weaker males were excluded from reproduction entirely. Natural selection, but with a very ugly human face. What makes this even more disturbing is that these weren't aberrant behaviors, they were successful evolutionary strategies. Groups that practiced sexual coercion and dominance-based reproduction often outcompeted more egalitarian societies simply because they produced more offspring and maintained stronger group cohesion through fear-based hierarchies. Some anthropologists argue that human capacity for both extreme violence and extreme cooperation evolved together, shaped by reproductive systems where sexual access was a prize worth killing for. The same tribal loyalty that helped early humans survive also enabled systematic oppression of the physically weaker members of their own groups. And the genetic consequences of all this prehistoric drama, they're still shaping human behavior in ways we're only beginning to understand. Every time you feel inexplicably attracted to someone who's probably bad for you, thank your Neanderthal ancestors. Every time you experience jealousy, tribalism, or the urge to show off for potential partners, you're channeling reproductive strategies that were literally life or death decisions 50,000 years ago. Modern genetic analysis reveals that the sexual chaos of early human evolution didn't just create physical diversity. It created psychological and behavioral diversity that still influences human culture today. Different populations carry different mixes of ancient DNA, which correlates with different approaches to social organization, risk-taking, and even sexual behavior. The genetic legacy of prehistoric reproductive strategies shows up in everything from modern disease resistance patterns to psychological predispositions toward monogamy or promiscuity. Some populations carry genetic markers associated with higher testosterone production, a possible legacy of selection for physically dominant males. Others show genetic patterns, suggesting historical selection for cooperative breeding behaviors. But here's the kicker. We're still evolving. Every Tinder match, every decision about when to have children, every choice about partner selection is continuing the same evolutionary process that started with our ancestors' bizarre reproductive experiments. We just trade clubs and caves for dating apps and apartments. The DNA you inherited from those prehistoric sexual pioneers determines everything from your immune system to your mating preferences to your capacity for forming social bonds. You are quite literally the product of thousands of years of successful sexual experimentation by ancestors who would probably be arrested for their reproductive practices today. And the evolution continues, with every swipe, every match, every reproductive choice, adding new chapters to the ongoing story of human genetic development. So here's your takeaway from this journey through the sexual hall of fame and shame of early human evolution. Everything you think you know about normal human sexuality is a recent cultural invention layered on top of hundreds of thousands of years of reproductive chaos. Monogamy, invention of agricultural societies who needed clear inheritance lines. Sexual consent is a fundamental right, product of modern legal systems and social equality movements. The idea that sex should be about emotional connection rather than genetic survival. That's newer than indoor plumbing. Your ancestors survived ice ages, volcanic winters, predators, diseases, and environmental catastrophes that wiped out entire species. They did it by being ruthlessly pragmatic about reproduction, willing to cross any social boundary if it meant their genes survived one more generation. Every taboo they broke, every immoral choice they made, every shocking reproductive strategy they employed, it worked. You're the proof. Modern human sexuality is essentially a thin veneer of civilized behavior painted over a reproductive engine, designed by evolutionary pressure and refined through thousands of years of survival-based sexual selection. We've gotten really good at pretending we're above our primitive impulses, but scratch the surface of any modern relationship, and you'll find behavioral patterns that would make perfect sense to a Neanderthal. Think this exploration of early human reproduction is as weird as anthropology gets? Next time, we're diving into the evidence that some early human groups practiced ritualistic cannibalism as part of their funeral rites, and why some scientists think these death feasts might have been the ultimate expression of love and respect. Because apparently, eating your deceased relatives was just another way early humans said, "I care about you." If you survived this journey through the sexual evolution of early humans without questioning everything you thought you knew about, human nature, hit that subscribe button for more uncomfortable truths about our ancestors. And remember, every time you feel weird about your own dating life, at least you're not trying to continue the species while dodging cave bears and figuring out which of your tribal neighbors might be genetically compatible. Because the real question isn't whether early human sexual practices were moral by today's standards. The real question is, what current reproductive behaviors will make our descendants cringe with embarrassment 50,000 years from now? Before we go further down this rabbit hole of evolutionary awkwardness, let's establish the scientific foundation for everything we're about to discuss. This isn't speculation or salacious storytelling. This is peer-reviewed research from some of the world's leading evolutionary anthropologists, geneticists, and archaeologists. The evidence comes from multiple sources: genetic analysis of ancient DNA extracted from bones and teeth, comparative studies of modern human genetic diversity, archaeological analysis of burial sites and living spaces, and comparative studies with our closest primate relatives. When multiple independent research methods all point to the same conclusions, you can be pretty confident you're looking at actual historical patterns rather than academic speculation. That said, we're reconstructing behaviors that happened before written language, often based on fragmentary evidence separated by thousands of years. So while the broad patterns are scientifically solid, some of the specific details require educated interpretation. Think of it as evolutionary detective work with a very cold case file. And trust me, the evidence trail leads to some conclusions that make CSI look like a children's show. Before modern viewers get too judgmental about early human reproductive practices, remember that these behaviors developed under environmental pressures that make today's challenges look like minor inconveniences. No hospitals, no reliable food sources, no protection from predators, no social safety nets, and lifespans so short that reaching reproductive age was already beating the odds, when your entire world could be wiped out by a bad winter, a disease, outbreak, or territorial conflict with neighboring groups. Reproductive strategies that seem shocking today were literally life-saving innovations. These weren't moral failures. They were adaptive solutions to survival problems we can barely imagine. Plus, let's be honest about modern human sexuality. We've got dating apps that reduce potential partners to profile photos, pornography industries that dwarf most countries' GDP, and reproductive technologies that let us choose genetic traits like we're customizing a car. Our ancestors might have been physically rougher, but at least they weren't trying to optimize their children's eye color. The real difference is that we've gotten better at hiding our weirdness behind technology and social conventions. The most unsettling aspect of studying early human sexual behavior isn't just learning what our ancestors did, it's recognizing how much of their reproductive psychology we've inherited, basically unchanged. Modern evolutionary psychology suggests that contemporary human sexual behavior is still largely driven by mental adaptations that evolved during the Paleolithic period. That urge to show off wealth and status to attract mates, that's your inner Homo erectus trying to demonstrate hunting prowess. The tendency for human females to be attracted to dominant, confident males. Thank your female ancestors who survived by choosing partners capable of protecting offspring. The male drive to seek multiple partners while simultaneously becoming jealous and possessive. Welcome to Stone Age reproductive strategy played out in modern dating. Even our modern concepts of beauty and attraction trace back to reproductive advantages that mattered in prehistoric environments.